Welcome, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for joining our latest in our OIE Meetup series. This is the most recent in our Foundations of OIE series. Um, the goal of the series is to kind of provide a deeper understanding of some of the big changes, the fundamental changes in the OIE framework to kind of help you understand, I guess, the whys of why things are changing and how to then extrapolate those to your own custom integrations or custom configurations. Um, my name is Brent Arrington. I'll be leading you through the presentation today, and I'm supported as always by a cast of very smart people who help us prepare this material and then also help us with Q&A. So shout out to all of my colleagues as well. Before we dive into today's presentation, I will throw out the ubiquitous safe harbor statement. We may discuss some forward-looking features or capabilities in this presentation, so please keep that in mind. Um, as you can see, we have a fairly packed agenda for today, so we'll dive right in pretty shortly here. I will do a brief intro and overview, and then we'll get right into the main topic for today, which is our authentication policy framework in OIE. So we'll talk about authenticator enrollment policies, the changes there, recovery and account management policies, global session policies, authentication policies, which are your app level authentication policies. We'll talk about some new policies and new capabilities that are brand new to OIE. We'll talk about the impact of all these policy changes on custom integrations that you may have built. And we will hopefully have some time at the end for Q&A. And if we have time left over, we'll go through I guess, a set of resources that are available to you if you have ongoing questions or want to get extra help in your either journey to upgrade to OIE or journey to roll out OIE capabilities. Just a couple of notes, sort of logistical notes before we dive in. You should see in the Zoom console a Q&A section. As we go through the presentation, if you have questions, please add those to the Q&A. That will queue the questions up for us, and when we get to the end of the presentation today, we'll address those questions. If for some reason we don't have time to get to all of the questions today, we will have a record of those in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that we address those and get those posted in our community site, the webinar office hours hub on the community site, and we'll share the link for that with you. Actually, while I'm thinking about it, let me do that right now for those of you that are on the live. Here we go. Those of you who are on the live session, I'm going to throw this in the Zoom chat. So we have a series of links here. The first one there is that webinar office hours hub, and that's where you can find a lot of additional resources, one-on-one office hours support, as well as links to information about upcoming events like these webinars, as well as when we have recordings released and that sort of thing. That's also where I will post any questions that we don't get to in today's session. So please be aware of that. All right. So diving into our content for today. First off, just again, a little reminder of what this series is all about. So again, this is to promote kind of a deeper understanding of the how and why of the changes in OIE so that you can then extrapolate the specific impact of those broad changes to your specific configurations or your specific custom integrations, whatever the case may be. We have, this is now the fourth I guess, session in this series. We had an initial kickoff, and we've had two previous sessions focused on kind of deep dives into the other kind of primary areas of change. Today's session is, of course, on the policy framework changes. The next session is going to start focusing on our fourth and final sort of pillar of change in OIE, which is around the impact on custom integrations. And because that's such a big topic, we're actually going to divide that one into three separate parts. So the next deep dive will be part one of that topic, focused primarily on the redirection model for custom integration. So mark your calendars for that. That QR code that you see there will take you to the registration page for that session if you're interested in that. It's going to be at the end of June on the 26th. That's a Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. Hope to see you there. So for today, let's start by talking about enrollment policies. Now, we touched on this a little bit in our previous session around authenticators, but there are a few notable changes around enrollment policies in OIE as compared to Classic. So number one, the enrollment policies now apply to all authenticators, including password. So in Classic, there was a clear distinction between password as sort of your primary authenticator and then everything else is MFA. And in Classic, the factor enrollment policies only apply to that everything else bucket, don't apply to password. That changes in OIE. So you will start to see password get pulled into these policies. I will talk about the impact of that in just a bit. These also apply not only to like all of your authenticators, including password, but it applies to authenticators that are used for both authentication purposes as well as authenticators that are used for recovery purposes. And again, in Classic, there was a clear separation previously with enrollments that you had for recovery purposes, like if you had an SMS or a voice, like a phone number enrolled for recovery purposes, that recovery enrollment was a separate thing from any phone enrollment that you might have had for actual authentication purposes. In OIE, that changes again. So everything is just an authenticator. Everything is subject to these policies. Certain types of authenticators can be flagged for use for recovery and authentication, some recovery only or vice versa. And then another big change is that the password authenticator, because it's now just another authenticator, it can actually be optional in OIE, or you could completely disable it if you wanted to. So if you're trying to move towards a passwordless experience, you can facilitate that by making password enrollment either optional, or if you really want to go to the extreme and do away with passwords altogether, you can completely disable enrollment in passwords. So I want to dive into the admin console here really quick and take a look at the authenticator enrollment screen just a second and kind of show you a little bit of what that slide was talking about. So if we go from our admin console, if we go to security and authenticators, and from there enrollment, this is where you'll find your enrollment policies when you switch to OIE. These will all be migrated over from, if you're on Classic, these will all be migrated over from your factor enrollment policies in Classic. Again, like I said, the big change is going to be that password is now going to get pulled in to these policies. And as noted, you do have an ability to set password as either required or optional or disabled altogether if you wanted to. One other new capability that you'll see, and I think this is still an early access feature, but it should be a self-service early access feature, so you can enable this if you choose. But for any authenticator that you set to required, you can choose to allow a grace period for that enrollment. So if I wanted to, for example, make Okta Verify a required enrollment, I could do that, but then I could say, okay, I'm going to require it, but I'm going to give you some period of time before you actually have to do that. So if you're trying to roll out new authenticators or new requirements from an authenticator standpoint, this is a handy way to do that without completely blocking users from logging in on day one, at least give them a little bit of a grace period. The other thing I want to point out that is new here is for the FIDO2 or WebAuthn authenticator type specifically, there's an ability to define authenticator groups. The authenticator groups would be defined under the actual FIDO2 authenticator settings itself. But once you've defined those groups, you can reference those in your enrollment policy. So I already have a group defined for FIPS compliant FIDO2 authenticators that has a list of specific FIDO2 authenticators that are part of that group. So if I want to limit enrollment to only those specific groups, then I can do that by creating the group first, defining which specific FIDO2 authenticators are part of that group, and then referencing that here in the enrollment policy. And then from a rule standpoint, this is more or less the same as what you would see in Classic. The one thing that's a little different here is that this option is a little different than what you see in Classic. So in Classic, you would see a basically the timing of when a user would get prompted to enroll in an authenticator. So your options would be prompt at the very first login, or prompt the first time they would be challenged for MFA, or you could just do not enroll, like do not prompt at all. Here, it's a little bit different. So here you can either choose to allow enrollment for any type of authenticator that would encompass both authenticators used for authentication as well as those used for recovery. You could allow only enrollment in authenticators that are used for recovery, or you could just deny enrollment altogether. When you choose this option for all authenticators, but just by the nature of the way that the app level authentication policies work now, and the fact that you can actually define specific types of authenticators that are required for certain applications, and as opposed to just a binary, one factor or two factors. Because of that, the timing of when a user would get prompted for an authenticator is kind of tied to the specific requirements on the app level authentication policies, and we'll talk about that in just in more detail just a bit later. But essentially, whenever you encounter a policy that's looking for an authenticator type that you're missing, this option would allow you to be prompted in line to add that authenticator type if you don't already have it. All right, let me switch back to my slides here. So that's enrollment policies. Recovery policies are also new, or have some new capabilities in OIE. So first off, there are a couple of different ways now that you can manage the authentication requirements around recovery flows. So you can continue to manage it sort of the legacy way, like the same way that you do in Classic, where directly in line in the password policy itself, you can choose what authenticators can be used to initiate the flow, as well as to provide the additional verification for those flows. But you also now have a second option, which is a dedicated Okta account management policy that's in the same area as your app level authentication policies, that governs or can govern not just your recovery flows, but it also governs basically any end user self-service account management activity. So what that would look like if we switch back into our application here. So first off, for the kind of legacy way of managing this is going to be under your password authenticator settings. So under authenticators and password, if we edit our password configuration, this is where you're going to see all of your Classic style password policies. And these will still include the rules where you would have your recovery options configured. So you can choose what sort of self-service password activities the users can take on their own behalf. So they can change their own password. This would not be a recovery flow. This would be when they actually know the password and provide it to, or provide some other credential potentially to change the password. And then you can choose to allow for password resets or account unlocks for recovery flows as well. For the recovery flows, you've got a couple of options. So by default, if you're upgrading from Classic, you're going to be using this legacy path, which is where you can define here within this password policy itself what can be used to initiate this recovery flow, like what specific authenticators. And then also, if you want to require additional verification at the end of that flow, what is required for that step as well. So you'll notice you have, even in this legacy flow, you've got some additional options that did not previously exist in Classic. So in addition to the phone factors and email to initiate the flow, which you would have had in Classic as well, you also have the option to initiate the flow with a push notification from Okta Verify or using an OTP through Google Authenticator. And then in addition to that, for that additional verification piece, which is sort of the final step after you click the link or provide the code or whatever the case may be, that final step before you can actually reset your password or before it actually unlocks your account. In Classic, it would have been either not required at all. So you would just click your link or provide your code and then immediately be able to reset your password or immediately have your account unlocked. Or in Classic, you could have required a security question as that additional verification. So you still have those two options here, but you also now have the ability to choose any other authenticator that the user has enrolled that they're using for MFA or SSO purposes. So as an example, I could, in theory, initiate the flow with a push notification from Okta Verify, and then provide additional verification with maybe an SMS code or an email code, or if I have Google Authenticator enrolled, I could use that as well. Now, the key here, if you use this configuration, is that whatever is used to initiate this initial flow cannot also be used for the additional verification. So if you're going to use this configuration, you want to make sure that your users have at least two authenticators enrolled so that they have one of these they can use to initiate the flow and then something else that they can use to provide the additional verification. Now, in addition to this, there's also a newer way to manage this, which is to use the specific authentication policy, the Okta Account Management Authentication Policy, to manage this. And that is going to live as a dedicated policy under your authentication policies. These are your app level policies. Right at the top of that screen, you'll see Okta Account Management Policy. And this can be used not just to govern your recovery flows if you choose, but this also is the policy that would govern any protected activity that an end user would I guess, undertake on their own behalf. So going in to manage their account, changing their password, updating other authenticator enrollments, editing their personal information, et cetera. And if you click into the structure of this is very much like all of the other authentication policies as far as the requirements that you can put in place here. The one thing I will point out is that you will always have this catch-all rule, and the catch-all rule has this option, which basically helps to account for the initial onboarding use case. So this progressive authentication option that's available in the catch-all rule allows users to authenticate with whatever initial authenticator they have, like a single authenticator potentially, if that's the only thing they have. So even if your rule requires two authenticators generally to perform these actions, if they only have a single authenticator enrolled, that would suffice until they have the second authenticator enrolled. And then from that point forward, they would be required to provide two authenticators to undertake these actions. So that accounts for the initial bootstrapping use case. All right. Let's switch back to our slides. So that's recovery policies. The next big area of change is global session policies. And there's not a huge difference, honestly, in the global session policies from the global sign-in policies in Classic. So that is basically what these are. These are sort of the renamed or rebranded global sign-in policies from Classic. And whatever you have today configured as your global sign-in policies, those will migrate over one for one to the global session policies in OIE. There are a couple new capabilities, though, that have been added to the global session policy. Probably the most critical one is the fact that you now have the ability to delegate the specific authenticator requirements for establishing your initial session, to delegate that to the app level policy requirements. And we'll look at that in just a second. But this is a capability that's going to be key as you look towards moving to like passwordless flows, for example, because this will allow you to do away with a password requirement, even at the global session policy level, as long as you're delegating that to the app level policy and your app level policy does not require a password explicitly. There's also a new option to control a persistent cookie setting. I'll touch on that a little bit. That's one thing that we typically recommend that you don't allow persistent cookies. There is an ability to do that if you choose, but you should use that wisely. But I'll show you where that is. And actually, let's go ahead and jump into those policies. So in OIE under security, global session policies, again, this will be, if you're on Classic today, when you upgrade, this is going to be where your global sign-in policies get migrated. So every global sign-in policy that you have today in Classic will get migrated over one-for-one here to functionally the same level. And if we look at the rules here, you can see a lot of the structure is going to be very familiar to you. You can target these rules based on the same sorts of criteria as you can in Classic. You can target specific identity providers, specific authentication methods, behaviors, risks, etc. This is the key sort of new capability here. If you're migrating or if you're upgrading from Classic, your existing policies are going to migrate like this, where your session is established explicitly with a password, and then you can either require MFA or not. As once you're on OIE and as you're getting ready to kind of move towards the more OIE centric way of managing authentication policies and potentially hopefully moving to passwordless flows, you're going to want to start changing your global session policies to use this option, where you are essentially delegating the specific authenticator requirements to whatever is spelled out in the authentication policy for the specific application that you're accessing as you're establishing your initial session. This is another sort of fundamental change in as far as how the flow works for authentication flows in OIE versus Classic. In Classic, there's an ability to have just kind of a generic authentication flow to your Okta tenant that doesn't reference any specific application. So there would be no application context necessarily provided as part of that authentication request. In OIE, every single authentication request has application context. And therefore, there will always be not just a global session policy to be evaluated, but there will always be an app level authentication policy that would be evaluated in conjunction with that. That can help determine what the specific authenticator requirements are, even if you're going through the global session policy and establishing your initial session. The session lifetime, like maximum idle time, maximum session lifetime, those are all pretty much unchanged. This is one new option here in OIE. We strongly recommend in almost every use case that you disable persistent cookies. There may be some very specific use cases where you would want to enable this, but just use that with caution. Generally speaking, you would want to leave this disabled, but this is where this option would be if you didn't need it for a specific case. All right, let's jump back into our slides. So that's the global session policies. Now, the authentication policies or your app level policies. This is really where the bulk of the new capabilities reside in OIE. So one of the fundamental changes is just in the way that these app level policies are managed now in OIE. In Classic, it was really very difficult to manage app level authentication policies because you had to go to every single application that you wanted to apply an app level requirement on and define that requirement directly at the app the application settings, and you had to do it for every single application. So even if you wanted to have the same exact policy requirement across 100 different applications, you had to go to all 100 applications and define that policy 100 times in order to get that policy at the application level. So one of the big changes is that you no longer have to define your policies multiple times. You can define a policy one time and then assign it to all of the relevant applications. So if you've got, let's say, you want to define uh, like a handful of like buckets of or categories of applications, maybe your high assurance applications, medium assurance applications, and low assurance applications. You can define a policy for each of those scenarios one time and just assign all of the appropriate applications to the correct policy based on what bucket they fall into. So you don't have to go and replicate you don't have a lot of duplications of efforts there. The other thing is, or one of the other big changes is that now, in addition to simply, adding a requirement for MFA or not, or maybe denying access altogether, if you're going to require MFA, it's no longer just a binary, on or off, like for the MFA requirement. You can get very specific about what kinds of authenticators will satisfy a particular policy. So that can be done in a couple of ways. You can either add specific constraints or specific characteristics of the authenticators that will satisfy the policy. So for example, you could say, I'm going to require a phishing resistant authenticator in order to satisfy this policy, or I'm going to require user interaction with biometrics, et cetera. Or you can even call out specific authenticators by name as either being allowed or disallowed. So I can say for a given policy, I'm only going to accept FastPass or FIDO2 for this particular policy. Or maybe I do the opposite and I will accept anything except I'm going to specifically disallow SMS and email, something along those lines. And then in addition to that, we also have some new capabilities in terms of defining device assurance requirements in order to satisfy a policy. These work in conjunction with one of the new policy types, which are device assurance policies. So we'll talk about how to define those policies in just a bit. But once those policies are defined, you can reference those within your app level authentication policies. So let's take a look at what those look like here. So if we go back into our admin console and we go under security and authentication policies. So again, as we saw previously, the first thing you're going to see at the top is this account management policy. This is what you can define to govern all of the end user kind of self-service account management activities. And then below this, you have all of your app level policies. And you'll notice you can define your policies, give your policy a name. And then on the right-hand column, you can see all the applications that a particular policy applies to. So in this case, we can see for our default policy, we've got 12 applications. If we want to see all the apps, we can see a list of all of those here. We can search for specific applications that may be governed by a particular policy. If we go back to our authentication policies here, you'll notice that even some of the Okta specific kind of first party apps like the Okta dashboard or Okta browser plugin or admin applications, they have their own policies that are defined. Now, these are defined as defaults out of the box, but you'll notice that you don't necessarily have to use these policies for the designated applications. So we've got an Okta dashboard policy that is created as a default policy, and your Okta dashboard will be assigned to that initially, but it doesn't have to stay there. You can assign it to a different policy if you want. So you can see in this example, we've moved the Okta dashboard to a different policy. You'll also notice for certain applications, specifically for Office 365, Office 365 has some unique characteristics and unique capabilities that don't apply to other applications. So it will always have its own separate policy. But otherwise, you'll see policies kind of get uh, lumped together or merged together under like specific policies that apply to multiple applications. And if you're upgrading from Classic, that sort of merging of policies is done for you automatically. So part of the upgrade process is your policies will be evaluated if you do have app level, like specific app level policy requirements. Those will be evaluated as part of the upgrade process. And where there are identical requirements across multiple applications, it will recognize that, it'll create a policy with those requirements, and then just assign all of the appropriate applications to that policy. And for those where you haven't added any specific additional requirements, and all you have is just the catch-all rule, you're going to see those fall into something called Classic Migrated, which functionally is basically the same as the catch-all rule in Classic, which basically just says that if you have an active session and you have an assignment to the app, then you're granted access. You'll see that Classic Migrated policy when you upgrade from Classic, and any applications that had no additional sign-in requirements or sign-in policies would just fall um, under that policy. So if we actually dive into any one of these, and I'm going to add a rule. So this is, as I was saying, this is really where a lot of the major changes would occur, or within the app level capabilities. First thing I want to point out is that we have this new ability to define a device assurance policy. So once you have defined these policies, I can say maybe I have a specific requirement that I want to, or a specific set of requirements that I want to enforce around all my Mac devices. So I can define an authentication policy that requires this device assurance policy. And this is basically is just a set of device level requirements, and we'll look at where to go to define these policies in a little bit later. But once these are defined, you can reference these specifically within your authentication policies as a requirement of being granted access to a particular application. And once you've gotten through all of your, I guess, criteria where you're defining, when this policy would apply, the next step is you can define like what action is taken. So again, just like with Classic, if you want, you can define a policy where you would deny access outright in certain scenarios. Or if you want to allow access, then you can define the conditions under which you're going to allow access. So here we have a number of options. So you can either choose one factor type, and you've got a number of options for one factor type. So you can either say, I'm explicitly going to require a password or an external identity provider for users who don't have passwords directly in your Okta tenant. Like if you have inbound federations from external identity providers, that would satisfy a password requirement as well. So you could explicitly call out password. You could explicitly call out a possession factor, like a single possession factor. And notice that when you do switch to possession factor, you get some additional options here. So for the possession factor specifically, this is where you can start defining your constraints if you choose. And as you do that, you'll see that the list of available authenticators that would satisfy this policy starts to dwindle. So if I'm going to require a possession factor, but I want it to be a phishing resistant possession factor, you'll notice that list gets dramatically smaller. So it's basically only FastPass or FIDO2 WebAuthn. Or maybe I'm not requiring phishing resistance, but I want to require user interaction, and I want to require biometric. So now we're down to Okta Verify Push or FastPass. Or maybe I want to allow for user verification with a biometric or passcode, in which case that pulls in FIDO2 as an option as well. So you can kind of play with the constraints to see what specific characteristics you want to enforce, or you can also choose to either allow specific authenticators by name. So I can say maybe I want to allow FastPass and Okta Push and FIDO2 explicitly. Or you could take the opposite approach. So I could specifically disallow certain things. So maybe I want to disallow password. Actually, sorry, password's not a possession factor, so it's not going to show up there anyway. I'm going to disallow SMS and voice and maybe email as well. Oh, I'm not allowing email for authentication, so that's why it's not showing up. And again, you can see your options here that would satisfy the policy based on the configurations that you have. So you can either, going back to our, I guess, our number of authenticators, you can either require one, a single factor type. You can explicitly call out password, IDP, you can explicitly call out possession factor, or you can say any one factor type. So it could be either a password or an external IDP or a possession factor. And you'll see when I choose that, I have both password as an option here, as well as all my possession factors. Or if you want to have a multi-factor requirement, then you've got a couple of options here. For under the two-factor types, you can do password specifically plus something else. So in this case, you can see password is sort of the initial requirement, and then you have to provide one other authenticator. Or you could do any two factors, in which case password would be optional. You wouldn't necessarily have to provide password. And you could even, if you wanted, explicitly disallow password here. And then finally, there is an option for authentication method chaining. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one because it's uh, honestly, I'm not a huge fan of this option. You're kind of uh, there are specific use cases where you might want to use this, but generally speaking, you're kind of painting yourself into a corner here because you're not giving as quite as much flexibility when you're defining an explicit authentication method chain. There may be situations where you want that, but generally speaking, it's probably better and a better end user experience if you give a little more flexibility. But this is very similar for any of you who may have used factor sequencing in Classic. It's the same idea. It's just this is now at the application level policy. So you define your initial authentication method, and then you can add additional steps as you go. So you can basically explicitly define exactly the sequence of events in terms of what authenticators are required and when they would, like the order in which they would be prompted. All right. Let me go back into my slides. So that is or those are authentication policies. Now, there are also just some brand new, like net new policies and capabilities that are new to OIE. So we have device assurance policies, which I referenced a little bit earlier. There also is a capability to set up profile enrollment policies, which which we'll take a look at here. Let me move this back just a little bit, if I can. Come on, go back. There we go. Oops, wrong one. Where's my? Here we go. Sorry, this annotate thing is getting in my way. Here we go. All right. There are also new APIs available for app level policies or new API capabilities for authentication level policies. Specifically, you can actually now use APIs to manage the specific app level MFA requirements, whereas you previously could not do that in Classic. And the existence of these APIs also, of these APIs also opens up the ability to have a Terraform provider updates, so a new Terraform provider and some updates to that. So if you're managing your policies programmatically, either directly with API calls or through a Terraform provider, you've got some new capabilities there in OIE. let's quickly take a look at some of those. So if I go back into my admin console, first thing I want to show you is the device assurance policies. So I referenced this briefly when looking at the authentication policies, but this is where you would go to actually define your device assurance policies. So as you can see, I've got a couple already defined here. If I add a policy, you start by choosing your platforms. So let's say I want to define a policy for a Windows platform. I give the policy name. Um, I can choose how I'm or where I'm retrieving these attributes from. So Okta Verify is always an option. This is uh, one of the new capabilities of the Okta Verify app, both on mobile devices as well as the desktop version that's available for OIE. So it natively can capture some device assurance signals for you from the device, regardless of whether you're using third-party integrations for that as well. You can also use Chrome Device Trust as well to capture additional attributes. So you can see under the Google attributes, you can get those additional attributes if you also choose Chrome Device Trust as one of your providers here. So you can choose one or the other or both. It's up to you. So you can set things like your operating system versions, lock screen requirements, disk encryption, etc. For the Google attributes, you can have firewall settings, uh, Chrome versions. So I guess it's important to note the Chrome Device Trust obviously does require using Chrome as the browser when you're accessing Okta, so keep that in mind. But with that, it unlocks um, some additional attributes that you can capture and define policies off of. And once you've set up your policy, you have an option for how you communicate to your end users if, for whatever reason, they are out of compliance with the policy you defined. So by default, it's going to hide remediation instructions, but you can choose to display remediation instructions in the event that a user's device does not meet your compliance requirements as defined in this policy. And you can also choose to provide a grace period. So you can either explicitly set a date, like a hard line in the sand, where you have to be compliant by a certain date, or if you want to give a kind of relative number of days. So from the time that the user receives the non-compliance message, they have X number of days to get to get their device in compliance before they would actually be blocked from any access based on this device assurance policy. Um, and then you can also configure custom posture checks. So these custom posture checks, you would configure these outside under advanced posture checks, and you can reference those specifically here in your device assurance policy as well. And then, as we saw previously, once these are defined, you can reference the specific policy in your app level authentication policies, and that then becomes a requirement of that authentication policy. So in addition to whatever authenticator requirements you may have placed on that policy, the user's device would also need to meet this device assurance policy. The next thing that I wanted to look at is what was it? The profile enrollment policies. So again, under security, if we look at user profile policies, so here you have an ability to define specific policies around self-service registration or profile enrollment. If we look at this, we have a default policy, which is what pretty much every application will fall into initially. But if we look at the things that you can specify here, um, the first thing is whether self-service registration is allowed or not. So you can either allow users to sign up, like self-register, or you can block that. You can either enable or disable progressive profiling. And this is something that you can use to sort of build out an overall user profile kind of a staged manner. So you might have, if you think about kind of an e-commerce scenario, you might have an initial application that is just for accessing your site and browsing. Maybe you throw up a promotional offer, get 10% off, if you provide an email, and that drops them into a policy for an application where the only requirement is an email address, and that will start their profile. And then maybe as they continue through the site, if they want to save a shopping cart or if they want to check out, that would be associated to a different application with a, a, a different user profile policy that requires additional attributes, and they would only get prompted as they access those other applications. So kind of on a need to know basis, you would prompt for the additional attributes that way. Um, you can configure some options around how these enrollment pages are set up. If you need to do some custom logic kind of behind the scenes, as opposed to just letting any registration go through, you can do that using an inline hook. So you can specify a specific inline hook that executes, that helps with any sort of logic that you may need to run to verify before allowing for registration. And then you can basically build out your form. So you can define the form labels, which fields you want to present, whether those are required or not, et cetera. And again, the key thing here is that these policies can be targeted to specific applications. So if I'm accessing application A, maybe all I need if I'm trying to sign up is an email. If I'm accessing application B, maybe I need an email plus a first and last name, maybe plus a physical address, or whatever your specific requirements are. But you can target those requirements to individual applications in these policies. All right. As I mentioned, there are also APIs now available for authentication policies. So you no longer have to come into the user interface to define your app level policy requirements. You actually can now do this all through APIs to create these policies that you see here under authentication policies. Or again, as I mentioned, if you're using Terraform, there's an updated Terraform provider that will allow you to do that programmatically as well. All right, let me switch back. All right, finally, the impact on custom integrations. So with all of these changes to the policy framework, there certainly will be some impact, or can be some impact, on custom integrations that you may have built, particularly if you're in Classic today and you've built integrations using Classic APIs, Classic SDKs, or an embedded widget even that's running in Classic mode. Now there are kind of two approaches that you can take to this. Well, I guess to take a step back, there are at a high level two categories of customization models. So if you're using the redirection model, where you're redirecting to an Okta hosted authentication page and then redirecting back into your application, then the impact is going to be very minimal, at least in terms of getting to the point where you can take advantage of these new policy capabilities. Because unless you've explicitly hard-coded unless you've explicitly hard-coded like an older version of the widget in your Okta hosted custom sign-in page, it's going to natively support all of these new capabilities. So if you're using the redirection model, as soon as you upgrade your tenant, you're going to start seeing the ability to utilize these new policies and have them actually evaluate properly within your login page. If you're using the embedded model, which is either like you're building your own login page and you're either building it with server-side API calls to Okta or server-side SDK functions that you're using to facilitate the authentication flow, or you have your own page that you're hosting and you're embedding the JavaScript widget, and it's running in classic mode. It, the immediate impact of just upgrading your tenant should be minimal. In other words, you should continue to operate at the exact same level, that classic level of functionality, even after you upgrade your tenant, because your custom code is still operating against the classic pipeline. So that authn pipeline that the server-side API calls use, or that the embedded widget uses when it's running in classic mode, that is all still present and available even after you upgrade your tenant to OIE. It just continues to operate at the same level of functionality as it did in Classic, and it would not be able to support some of the new capabilities that you would be able to configure in your policies once you get to OIE. So from an initial impact standpoint, you can upgrade your tenant and leave everything kind of running as is, as long as it's still in classic mode. But like when you're ready to actually start taking advantage of these new policy capabilities, you're going to need to change your code. So it's either, if you're using the widget, changing it to run in OIE mode and not classic mode, or if you're doing server side embedded where you're using direct API calls, or you're using classic SDKs, you would need to refactor your code to use the OIE SDKs in order to take advantage of those capabilities. So let's take a look quickly at a little example of that. And I'm going to go back first into my admin console here. I've got an application that I'm using, and I've got it assigned to this no password policy. So specifically, it's this. Oh, did I change my policy? I think I did. Where's my interaction code policy? Hang on, let's approach this from a different path. Let's go to my applications and let's look. Here we go. So let me switch this over. All right. Change my policy for that one really quick. So if I go back to authentication policies, I want to assign it to this no password policy. Here we go. Now this is kind of an extreme example here, because what I'm doing in this policy. Okay, there we go. So what I'm doing in this policy is I'm basically completely disallowing passwords. So if I look at my rule here, I'm specifically requiring a possession factor. And I'm actually requiring user interaction with that possession factor. So based on this policy, these are the only authenticators that would satisfy it. So Google Authenticator, Okta Verify Push, FastPass, TOTP, whatever, right? Password is nowhere to be found here. Now, I have a custom application, and let me toggle over to that. Where is my Safari? Here we go. So I have a very simple custom application. This is a web page with an embedded widget. If this loads. And right now I have this set to run in, OIE mode. So I have the use classic engine configuration or it's commented out. So it's using the default, which in this version, which is 7 or later, in this version of the widget, this setting defaults to false. So by having this commented out, I am setting use classic engine to false, which means I'm operating in OIE mode. And if I look at what that renders like, I can see that my widget renders in OIE mode, and I can tell that because it's showing me my FastPass option here. If I try to log in, oops, I need to refresh this. Here we go. Let's try that again. So when I try to log in, I can see that the options that I'm presented with are in line with what my policy said. All of these are possession factors. Password is not an option for me at all, so I have to use one of these possession factors. I'm going to do push notification. And once I provide that, now I'm in, and all this app does is basically retrieve my tokens and print them out. Now, if I clear this and log out, if I go back to this custom application, if I have this still operating in classic mode. Now, again, this is pointing to a tenant that is already on OIE, but by setting this option, I'm having my custom page operate in classic mode. Like this widget is now going to operate in classic mode. And so when I do that and I refresh this page, we can see obviously the rendering changes a bit. I no longer see my FastPass option, and now I see username and password. Now, if you recall, I've set in my policy specifically, password is not allowed. My policy says that I have to provide a possession factor, but because I'm operating in OIE mode, that particular policy requirement is not enforced because that's not a capability that exists in Classic. So simply by providing a password, I'm able to bypass the requirements that I set up in my policy because my custom application was still operating in Classic mode. Now, that's again, as I said, a bit of an extreme example, but it's just to illustrate the point that if you have custom integrations that were built on a classic model, when you upgrade your tenant, you want to be careful about the changes that you make to the policies that would apply to those custom flows, because any of the new OIE specific capabilities are not going to be supported by those classic flows, even though the tenant is now on OIE. And this can have, or it can create some unexpected outcomes potentially in terms of how your policies are evaluated, what requirements are there. And this applies to any policies, not just your authentication policies, but it could potentially apply to recovery policies or the user enrollment policies, et cetera. So keep that in mind as you're going through your upgrade path. If you have custom integrations, you want to make sure that you know which specific policies are applying to those custom integrations and really kind of leave those as they are when they migrated. Because if you start changing things, it may not be clear to you which things are OIE specific and which things aren't. So you could start configuring things that you think will solve particular use cases for you, but if it's an OIE only feature and your custom integration is running in classic mode, it's not going to honor that. So keep that in mind. All right. We are coming up on the end of our time. Let me quickly switch back. I think we are, that was our demo. All right. So unfortunately, I talked probably a little longer than I had expected. I didn't leave a whole lot of time for questions. Let me quickly check the Q&A. We do have a few questions here. So let me quickly go through those before I wrap up for today. So first question I see is around FIDO2, the FIDO2 group. Yes, that FIDO2 authenticator group, that is a list of authenticators. So if you go into the authenticator settings for FIDO2 WebAuthn specifically, under that specific authenticator setting is where this option would reside. And you can basically go under there and define an authenticator group. Actually, here, let me just show you instead of talking about it. So here you would go, let me cancel out of this. So under authenticators for FIDO2, this is where you would go for authenticator groups. So this is where you would define your group. You can add a group, give it a name, and then you can select from the list, which authenticators you want to allow, et cetera, in that list. So there's a big list of sort of predefined authenticator types. You can see this is a large list. So basically, you define your group, and then you can reference that from your authentication policies. Um, all right, next question. Is it possible to separate out the biometric feature for authentication when using authentication chain? So, as an example, start with FastPass if biometric, fulfill MFA. If it's just FastPass without biometric, require another factor. I'll be honest with you, I have not played with the factors, the authentication method chain that much to know whether that's specifically doable through the authentication method chain. Um, but if what you're looking to do is set a requirement for um, biometric or a different requirement without biometric, that's probably easier accomplished without the authentication method chain. Like um, basically, uh, you could have devices, you could have rules that are targeted to devices that would support the biometric versus those that don't, and then have your policies constructed accordingly. Um, I'll have to do a little research. I'll like tinkering with the authentication method chain to see if you could define that sort of logic within the authentication method chain itself. I haven't really played with it enough to say for sure. What I would recommend, I'm not sure who asked this question, but I would recommend signing up for an office hour session, and we can kind of walk through that together and see the best way to address that. All right, and then finally, the last question or Q&A, what's the user experience when Okta account management policy is in place during the user enrollment? So the specific experience is going to depend on the policy, obviously. So depending on what your specific requirements are, that will dictate what they're prompted for, like what they're asked to provide as far as that initial enrollment. The key thing from the initial enrollment standpoint is that catch-all rule that I called out, where you have the progressive, what do they call it? The progressive authentication. So this is the key for that initial onboarding case where maybe all I have is one authenticator to start with. And so even though my policy may require two authenticators generally for kind of ongoing account management, for that initial onboarding flow, the progressive authentication will allow me to use the one authenticator that I have to enroll a second authenticator, and then from that point on, then we would adhere to whatever the policy requires. All right. So those are the only questions that I see in the Q&A. I'm going to, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to stop share. I'm going to quickly call out uh, one resource here. Here we go. Uh, this is our webinar office hours hub. The QR code here will take you to that site on our community site. For those of you, if you have specific questions going forward, I recommend you go here, sign up for an office hours session. They're one-on-one. It will be with either myself or one of my colleagues. We can help answer any specific questions you may have one-on-one or go through any specific use cases you have. This is also where we post updates on upcoming webinars like this one. When we have recordings of these sessions available, those get posted there as well. You can ask questions directly there in that form as well. So this is a great resource to keep bookmarked for any questions that you may have related to OIE. With that, I thank you all for your attendance. I know we've gone a little bit over time here, so I appreciate you all hanging out with me here for a little extra time. Thanks as always for attending. We do, as I said, have another in this series coming up next month on on June 26th. That will be part 1 of our custom integrations topic. And specifically, it's going to focus on redirection model and some uh, best practices and new capabilities that are available for that custom integration model in OIE. So use that QR code to register there if you're interested. And otherwise, thanks again for your attendance, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.